History books are often written by the winners, but nature never lies. For decades, the mainstream academic narrative has held a firm grip on a single date, 1492. We are told that until Christopher Columbus stumbled upon the Caribbean, the Americas were a lost world, isolated from the rest of humanity by two vast, impassable oceans. But when independent researchers started finding African plants, African DNA, and African artifacts in the Americas that predate the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, the gatekeepers of history had to come up with an excuse. They called it natural drift. They claimed that seeds simply fell into the ocean in Africa, floated across the Atlantic on currents, and coincidentally planted themselves in American soil, thriving perfectly without human help. Today, we are going to kill that theory. We are looking at three specific ancient plants that prove the Moors and West African navigators weren't just visiting the Americas. They were farming the land, engineering the soil, and conducting transatlantic trade centuries before the age of discovery. The first piece of evidence is the bottle gourd, known scientifically as Lagenaria ciceraria. This is one of the oldest cultivated plants in human history. For a long time, botanists were baffled to find the exact same species of bottle gourd in archaeological sites in Peru and Mexico dating back 8,000 to 10,000 years. The mainstream explanation was the drift theory. They argued that because a dried gourd can float in salt water for months and still have viable seeds inside, the ocean currents brought them over. But there is a massive hole in this logic. A plant doesn't just need to arrive, it needs to be cultivated. In the Americas, these gourds weren't found growing wildly on beaches like driftwood. They were found in domestic settings, used as containers, fishing floats, and musical instruments, the exact same way they were used in West Africa and the Moorish territories. Genetic sequencing has recently shown that the American bottle gourd is a direct relative of the African variety. While a gourd might float across the ocean, it doesn't walk itself miles inland to a mountain farm in the Andes and plant itself in an organized garden. The presence of the African bottle gourd in the earliest strata of American civilization points to one thing: deliberate transport by people who knew exactly how to use them. Now, let's look at the smoking gun of ancient botany, cotton. This is where the natural drift theory completely falls apart. There are two main types of cotton in the world: the Old World variety found in Africa and Asia, and the New World variety found in the Americas. If you look at the genetics of American cotton, specifically Gossypium hirsutum and Gossypium barbadense, you find something incredible. These are what scientists call tetraploids. This means they contain two sets of chromosomes, one set from a wild American ancestor and one set from an Afro-Asiatic ancestor. For this hybrid to exist, the African cotton plant had to meet the American cotton plant. Mainstream scientists tried to claim this happened millions of years ago via natural drift, but there is a problem. The African cotton seed is extremely sensitive to salt water. Unlike the bottle gourd, a cotton seed will rot and lose its ability to germinate within days of being submerged in the ocean. It cannot float across the Atlantic and remain viable. This hybridization required a human hand. It required someone to bring the African seeds across the ocean in a dry, protected environment and intentionally crossbreed them with local varieties to create the superior long staple cotton that the Americas became famous for. Who had the textile expertise to do this? The Moors were the master weavers of the medieval world. Their textile industry in Al-Andalus and North Africa was the envy of Europe. The fact that we find African-influenced cotton genetics in the Americas long before 1492 is a clear signature of Moorish and Malian agricultural science. The third plant is the sweet potato, or what the Caribbean natives called the ajay or batata. For years, the story was that the sweet potato originated in the Americas and was brought to the rest of the world by Europeans. But linguistic and botanical evidence tells a different story. In many parts of West Africa and among the Mandinka people, who made up the backbone of the Mali Empire, the word for a yam or a tuber is nyami. When the early Spanish explorers arrived in the Caribbean and parts of the mainland, they were shocked to hear the indigenous people using words almost identical to the African terms for these crops. Even more startling is the sweet potato's presence in Polynesia and parts of the African coast before the colonial era. Geneticists have found that the sweet potato moved across the Pacific and the Atlantic much earlier than previously thought. But here is the kicker: the sweet potato is a crop that requires careful propagation via cuttings, not just seeds. It is a heavy crop that doesn't just float and find a home. It travels with farmers. When you look at the voyages of Mansa Chu, also known as Abu Bakr II of the Mali Empire, he left the coast of West Africa in 1311 with a fleet of 2,000 ships. He wasn't just exploring, he was looking to settle. He carried gold, yes, But more importantly, he carried knowledge and seeds. The natural drift theory is a desperate attempt to maintain a Eurocentric timeline. It suggests that nature is capable of crossing the ocean, but the great maritime empires of Africa were not. This is a logical fallacy. We know the Moors had advanced knowledge of the wind of the return, the trade winds and the North Atlantic gyre. They knew that if you sailed south toward the Canary Islands and then west, the current would literally pull you to the Americas. They called the Atlantic the Green Sea of Darkness, but they didn't fear it, they mapped it. In his writings, the famous geographer Al-Masudi mentioned a Moorish navigator named Kashkash ibn Said who sailed across the Atlantic in 889 AD and returned with a cargo of treasures. What do you think those treasures included? They included new botanical species, new agricultural techniques, and a cross-pollination of culture that the history books refuse to acknowledge. When we look at the agricultural terraces of the Americas, they bear a striking resemblance to the terrace farming found in the Rif Mountains of Morocco and the highlands of Mali. The irrigation systems used by the ancient American civilizations used the same hydraulic principles that the Moors perfected in Spain to turn dry plains into lush gardens. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a transfer of technology. By farming the Americas, the Moors and their West African cousins left a living record of their presence. You can burn books, you can destroy statues, and you can rename cities, but you cannot easily erase the genetic lineage of the food we eat. The African bottle gourd, the hybrid cotton, and the linguistic trail of the sweet potato are silent witnesses to a forgotten era of global travel. They prove that the Atlantic was not a barrier, but a highway. The Moors were not just warriors and scholars. They were master botanists who understood that the true way to claim a land is to plant your seeds in its soil. It is time we stop looking at 1492 as the beginning of American history and start seeing it for what it really was, the late arrival of a group that was centuries behind the curve. The plants have spoken. The soil remembers. And the natural drift theory is officially dead. Think about the implications of this. If the Moors and West Africans were farming in the Americas, it means there was a level of cooperation and trade between the Old World and the New World that dwarfs anything Columbus could have imagined. It means that the Indian civilizations that the Europeans encountered were already familiar with the Old World. This explains why the Olmecs carved giant stone heads with African features. This explains why the Aztecs and Mayans had legends of black gods and visitors from the East. It wasn't aliens, and it wasn't drifting seeds. It was people. It was navigators who had mastered the stars and the currents. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want you to ask yourself, why is this information so suppressed? Why are we taught that Africans only arrived in the Americas in chains, when the botanical evidence shows they arrived as masters of the earth, bringing life and technology? Reclaiming this history is about more than just pride. It's about accuracy. It's about recognizing that humanity has always been connected, and that the story of the Americas is far older and far more diverse than the standard narrative allows. The next time you see a cotton shirt or a gourd used as a decoration, remember the hands that first brought those seeds across the deep blue. They weren't drifting, they were sailing with purpose. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the hidden archives of the past. If you found this information valuable, make sure to share it. History belongs to those who seek the truth. Stay curious, keep questioning the narrative, and we will see you in the next video.